All right, all. So thank you so very much for joining us today. My name is Karen Pierce, and I'll be acting as the moderator for today's webinar, where we're going to be covering the future of BIM. To just start off with some general introductions, we have Dwayne Miller on the phone. So he is CEO, of course, of Unify Labs. We also have Ben Gluntz, who is the CEO of BIMsmith, and Bill Allen, who's the CEO of Evolve Labs. And I'm sure you know him from his fantastic Autodesk articles, Autodesk presentations at AU, where he has talked about this future of BIM and what's coming. And he's even had a sequel out there. So Dwayne, I suppose maybe we'll start with you. So if you'd like to give us a bit of introduction about Unify and yourself.
Yeah, thanks for that, Karen. So as Karen said, CEO of Unify, also a co-founder. I actually, prior to starting to get into the software space in 2010, I've been in the building space since 1989. So I'm getting a little long in the tooth for these sort of conversations. But it's really excited to be with you today. At Unify, what we're really, when we started the company, it was actually incubated in a consulting engineering firm. And we had about 240 people, global offices, and we started migrating to Revit, ran into a lot of problems, started to solve some of those internally, and then saw that there was a bigger problem across the entire industry, not just within our own organization. So we kind of set out to help people, build a better now and enable a better future. And that kind of ties into the both and ethos of Unify. Want to make sure that we're dealing with our customers because our industry is based on velocity. So let's get them a tool in their hands that makes them better today, but then also being that both and of looking down the road and working with a lot of the people who are leading in innovation across the industry to make sure that we evolve our product in a way that's going to resonate. So happy to be with you here today. I'm an electrical engineer at PE, so I know a lot of the pain a lot of the people on the call have probably experienced. I've experienced it firsthand. And with that, I'll hand it back to Karen.
All right, thanks so much, Dwayne. Ben, would you like to go next, talking us a little bit about BIMsmith and what they provide?
Sure. Thanks for having me today. As Karen said, my name is Ben Gluntz. I'm CEO of Angularis Technologies, and we're the parent company of both BIMsmith and Swatchbox, if you're familiar with Swatchbox. My background, similar to Dwayne, I was in practice prior to founding the company in 2010. And I come from an architectural background, so that's part of the perspective I'll be bringing today. But for the purposes of BIMsmith today, we're an online research platform for architects, contractors, engineers, owners, to be able to find BIM content directly from manufacturer sources. So we source content and create content for manufacturers all over the globe. And it's a completely free tool to use if you go in and create a profile. And most excitingly, it's also directly integrated into your implementation of Unify. So you can add any of the BIMsmith manufacturers within your Unify software today. So check that out if you haven't looked at that yet.
Fantastic. Yes, I got to say the integration with our platform is unbeatable for sure. And of course, next is Bill Allen himself, so president at Evolve Lab. If you'd like to go ahead and tell us more about yourself, Bill.
Sure. Thanks, Karen, and thanks for having me on. Appreciate it. And hey, everybody. So Bill Allen with Evolve Lab. We do computational design and BIM consulting for architects, engineers, contractors, and owners, helping them implement design technology. Then we also have a few products. We have a SketchUp to Revit tool, converts SketchUp models to Revit, data visualization tool for real-time visualization within Revit. Also, we have a sister company, On Point Scanning, do LiDAR scanning, photogrammetry scanning, and also have a nonprofit, the Bare Roots Foundation, where we're trying to give back, help people get access to clean food, water, and shelter. Background is in architecture, was a BIM manager, but worked for about 10 years before that, working on actual projects, mainly hospitals and stadiums, but just couldn't get away from the design technology side. So nerd at heart, and happy to be on the program. Thanks, guys.
Oh, you're a nerd at heart for sure, and so are, I think, everybody on this call in our own ways. So a little bit about today's agenda. I mean, we're going to keep this super casual, so we encourage you guys to put your questions within the chat bubbles here. We're going to be addressing any outstanding Q&A at the end of today's presentation. And we're really going to kind of take us through the whole life cycle of where we've been, so the past, how we got here today, and of course, what the future holds. So by all means, don't be shy. All right, so with that, I think I will probably stop sharing my screen just so you guys can get a good look at all of our audio pictures here, and we'll get started. So let's just get started about the uncertainty, I guess, probably just the elephant in the room today of the uncertainty of BIM as a result of COVID-19. So Bill, Dwayne, Ben, how would you guys like to, who would like to start with addressing the current state of things?
I'm happy to weigh in on it, I guess. I think it's interesting because I don't think there's really any uncertainty around BIM or design technology. I think the uncertainty really is around what does the future look like. You know, with particularly my former firm when I was an electrical engineer, you know, working with JVA consulting engineers now in V5. You look at a lot of the build, you know, airports were big in the macroeconomic picture, you know, airports were really big, you know, the schools and universities, how they're going to change, convention space, how that may change. So I think the uncertainty associated with how is what we've learned from going through this pandemic journey, if we can call it that, you know, how is that going to influence, you know, what we're going to be building 5 years from now? And how that may change. Office space demand, is that going to go down? Are we going to stay as a remote workforce? So I think there's a lot of those macro things that are going to play into the domain that, and I think the uncertainty around that is a bit, I think gives everybody a bit of pause. So I'll shut up.
Yeah, I would agree with Dwayne that I don't think there's really any uncertainty about there being a future for BIM. If anything, I think we need it more than ever, and we need to be more efficient with it more than ever. And if you think about all the technological innovation that's happened over the last 15 years in the AEC space, you know, I've shared with my team in many ways, we've been working towards where we sit today as a society. And if you think back to the world where we lived 15 years ago, this shutdown and this crisis would be much worse across the board for all of us who are in practice and trying to run companies and work with our coworkers. There was no Slack, there was no iPhone.
There was no cloud.
There was no cloud.
Oh, imagine having 300 minutes and 100 text messages these days. I mean, think about it in basic terms like that.
Right. So when you think about all the things we didn't have 15 years ago that we now have that enable us to all work collaboratively, even though we're all apart, that's an exciting, you know, I'm really glad that we're at that point, because I think it could have been a lot worse if we hadn't achieved what we did achieved as an industry. I think we're very hard on ourselves from time to time saying, oh, the AEC industry is the slowest industry to adapt, only faster than the mining industry when you see these studies. And I hear that anecdote all the time. But you know, when you look back, it really does make you feel a little better, you know, to think what has been accomplished across the industry, but we do still have a long way to go as well.
Yeah, I really like the optimism on that, because I think through I mean, I don't want to undermine the seriousness of the pandemic. It's very serious. And there are serious ramifications, office space and people's health and things like that. But I would encourage also to think about, I think of a quote from Jay Samit from the book Disrupt You, where he says, you know, the difference between disruptors and everyone else is that they see problems as opportunities. And so what I'm actually seeing is a lot of firms step up and seeing like how they can address, you know, space planning. How do you actually bring people back into the workplace? And what does that mean programmatically for desk layouts and ventilation for mechanical and all of that? And so I also agree with Benjamin that I think we're in a very good place from a technology standpoint. The technology is there to support us, and we really don't have any excuses per se, you know, to actually execute on something. It's just a matter of will we actually do it? So I really appreciate the optimization of the panel for sure.
Well, I think, Bill, you're on something there too. If you think about how quickly all of us, Unify and yourselves were, and most of our customer base, how quickly they were able to transfer to a completely remote workforce, enabled by cloud technology, enabled by Slack, enabled by access to things like, BIM Smith and the different resources that you can get to through just having an uplink to the cloud. 15 years ago, you'd have been dead in the water. I think, VPN was probably the big advancement back then. It's like you could tunnel into your server, but I think that's a really good observation.
I absolutely agree with all that. And I really, in particular, kind of like what you said, Bill, about there's no excuses. We have technology more today than we ever have. And like you were speaking to even in the introduction, we have so much data these days. It's really going to be a matter of really harnessing that to be, I think, most efficient moving forward. So before we, of course, start moving forward, maybe a visit to the past at this point is a good opportunity. So where do people, maybe Bill, you might be best suited for this at the moment because of the nature of your business, but what's the biggest struggle that firms are currently facing adjusting to these last changes from, let's say, 20 years or so?
And specifically in the context of technology or in the context of COVID?
I think the context of just technology.
Technology?
We're hearing so much about COVID these days. It's sort of let's address it and always keep it in mind, but let's not make it the center of these conversations.
For sure. Yeah, I would say it ultimately comes down to culture. Is a firm, whenever I personally talk to a firm and we get a lot of people that reach out and say, hey, and surprised, actually, we're in the year 2020. I just got a call yesterday of a firm that wants to implement BIM, wants to implement Revit. So shock, surprise to people that are on the calls, people are still making this transition. And so my comment would be, though, is that whenever I have someone that reaches out and they want to implement a new technology, I start asking them about their leadership team, the culture at their firm, how willing are they to adopt new technologies? Why are you even considering this? Because what I want to get to, the heart of it is the culture of the firm, because it doesn't make sense, for someone, for a firm. I think that the culture piece of it is the part that holds people back the most. Again, to the earlier point, all the technology's there. With the advent of the internet, we have all the data you could ever want. So it ultimately comes down to culture and motivation of a firm, and whether or not they're willing to adopt, a new technology, in my opinion.
That's really well said and very insightful. Dwayne, with your experience, being a PE, having working at JBA, Revit was around even back then, but they were more the earlier days. So what was some of that struggle like being part of those early adopters?
Well, it's interesting because, I'm going to go back to a little bit what Ben said, and I love what Bill said, because we do have this reputation as an industry for being, they're technology averse and they're so slow to adopt. And I think what people who aren't from the domain don't understand is that the whole domain is based on velocity. If you're not going to give someone a tool that makes them better, in the relatively short term, because they don't have the time, they've got a project going out next Friday. They don't have time to spend 2 years learning the technology that you're giving them. And that's kind of alludes back to the both and of Unify. We're really sensitive to that fact that if we're not giving somebody a tool that makes them quicker and better right out of the chute, and we're not journeying with them and accompanying them to, more efficiency, then it's problematic. At a leadership level, I think Peter Drucker has said that, culture eats strategy for breakfast every day of the week. And you're spot on with that, Bill, because if the leadership in the company is just trying to check the technology box, if they're not really thinking about how do we evolve this organization so we remain relevant, and not only relevant, but how do we make the industry better? I mean, that's what leaders are really in the business of. We're in the business of better. We're in the business of being those dealers in hope, and in times like this pandemic, and making sure everybody understands, yes, this too will pass. We're going to have other crises, 10 years from now, and it's not the end of the world. We just have to adapt. And I think it was Jack Welch who said, the moment the rate of change external to your walls exceeds the rate of change internal to the walls, it's the beginning of the end. And I think that's what you see with a lot of the more stodgy types when it comes to adoption. And I started on hand drafting. I mean, that's how old I am. And then moved to CAD, and then we moved to Revit. And I think as technology has really become more and more commonplace, I think a mindset of being adaptive and being willing to try and innovate around that technology and that openness, which really comes from the CEO of the company down. If the CEO is not really pushing it, you've got a BIM lead or a design technologist who's having to carry that banner up the hill by themselves. It's really not a fair fight, because then your senior architects, your senior engineers, or your senior construction guys or owners like, well, this stuff's a waste of time, you know. And it's really, you've got to really commit to it at the highest level of the organization, and through the organization have that culture of agility that, you know, we're going to change and morph as technology can make us better at what we're doing. That's how they're going to stay competitively in the forefront. Anyway, I'll shut up. Sorry, I get passionate.
Oh no, that's having that, you know,
it gets me excited.
Exactly, and having that real firm experience is really, really important. Ben, having working with manufacturers, especially as many as BIM Smith has, are you seeing similar situations occurring, or what's that looking like right now?
That's a great question. You know, if anything, this has brought greater attention to the need for digital tools. We have certainly seen an uptick in interest, even folks who weren't necessarily interested in having a conversation with us before, suddenly void of all of their in-person tactics to be able to interact with architects and engineers and to be able to transfer knowledge and data to them in person, whether that be trade shows or in-person visits, or even phone calls to the firm. You know, those are all off the table. So it certainly has bred a lot more interesting conversations with manufacturers as they see the need to move forward with things like this, because the amount of options they have to interact with you all is it's gone down astronomically. So there are some who have been on the cutting edge of BIM from, you know, the early days of, you know, going back even 10 years that, you know, we're pushing the limits with all of this, and you know, they were all very well suited and prepared in more ways than just BIM, you know, digitally across their whole organization. But what it's really interesting, you know, as Bill and Dwayne alluded to, it does come down to the culture, and it does come down to whoever is making the call on how the money is spent. Because what I find is most lower level people are very forward thinking and interested in moving forward. We typically hit snags as it moves up the ladder. So, you know, that's super important. And I've shared with my team that in a lot of ways, COVID is the disruptor that we've all been, you know, looking for, in that it has forced everyone's hands, you know, all the holdouts who said, you know, I'll never allow anyone to log in from home. Well, guess what? You know, suddenly you realize it's not so bad, right? And we're finding that with a lot of companies as well, is that the thing they dreaded is actually really not that big of a deal. And what that does is it opens up a whole new realm of possibilities that they might not otherwise been open to considering. So that's been refreshing to see, you know, companies kind of take a step back and say, okay, Bill, you know, I know you've been telling me this for years, but you know, let's really talk about it now.
Agreed. And so I think we can all definitely agree that we've identified as culture really being the motivating factor and the really the key to all of it as far as implementing BIM, because you have to have that reason, that why, in order to move forward. But if, I don't know, is it reevaluating your culture? I think maybe that if anybody could do one thing today to kind of ease the struggle of adopting BIM, it's just maybe taking a look at that upper management and evaluating culture, or is there something else you guys might think of?
I think one of the things from a culture standpoint, I mean, it's tough for that from the trenches upward. That's a difficult thing to do. And I think it really comes down to getting the fear out of the mix. I mean, the reason that we run into hurdles as it moves up is we're moving further and further away from the trenches of execution, the people who actually understand what's involved with technology to get the job out the door. And you get to a point where you're dealing with someone in procurement who doesn't really understand that. And I think that's why you really need those executive champions who are engaged in what's going on with technology in the organization to be able to go influence the procurement person or the CFO or whoever it is that may be holding it, make them understand how critical it is that, and I think it's a heavy lift for someone in the trenches of execution or as a design technologist if they don't have an executive champion. So if I was in that role, the first thing I'd be looking for is what's the closest thing I have to a technology champion in the executive team that I can really start to have those conversations with.
Yeah, if I can comment on that too, I think a lot of times,
Absolutely.
you know, people will pass blame onto their leadership in the lack of ability for taking responsibility for their own leadership or their own initiatives. So I remember, you know, in the early days when I was working at an architecture firm, I was really interested in Grasshopper and trying to implement it on some of my projects. And, you know, the team, the company I was working for wasn't really interested, you know, in leveraging those kind of technologies on the projects. And so during the day, I would kind of be doing things business as normal, just working in a normal environment. And then on Friday nights, I remember sitting on the couch with my wife watching a movie, but I have my laptop open on my couch, you know, trying to figure out this solution in Grasshopper. So the other comment I would make, you know, for people is, you know, don't wait for someone to ask you and don't wait for someone to give you permission. Like put in some initiative, put in some extra time and go get after, go execute it.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I absolutely agree. Yeah,
ahead, Ben.
Ben, go.
Yeah, I was just agreeing.
Yeah, I think that's a key point, Bill, because if you can demonstrate, I'm kind of watching questions as they pop up, but if you can demonstrate that value or you can show an ROI, rather than trying to explain technology, make it tangible and give it context. And, you know, even the procurement guys, they understand return on investment, increasing efficiency and higher EBITDA. I mean, that conversation makes sense to them.
Well, and isn't it always true that it's so obvious to you, you know, when you're in the chair that's doing the drafting, how much time something is going to save you? That's so obvious. Right. And you just kind of assume that those up the ladder would understand that. And you know, the reality is, if you're running a company, you probably don't, and that's not necessarily your fault. But you know, it's important that when you're pitching something, you know, as the question in the chat box was saying, you're getting buy-in from leadership. You know, when you pitch things, put on your thinking cap of, if I'm the CEO or the key principal of this organization and I'm looking to achieve certain goals, try to put it in those terms. Because chances are, if you're wanting to do something and it's going to make your team more efficient or make more accurate, better drawings, you know, those types of things, then the ROI is probably going to be there. So you know, think that through, and as you make that pitch, try to look at it from that angle as well. Because what I find with my team when they come to me, you know, hey, we should do this, or hey, we should do that, is if it can tie in directly how we're going to make our team better, it becomes a no-brainer a lot faster.
Yeah, and speaking to that, I mean, Dan Warren put it really well. It was a little bit of a longer message, perhaps, but he has this new work from home environment, like we all do, where their content is scattered. You know, it's a mixture of, some of it's on a local server, some of it's on a local machine, some of it may even be stored in platforms like BIM 360. But his current team is actually really struggling to understand how the cloud now fits in this new working environment. So any advice as far as that question goes?
I think one of the challenges is you really, and we saw this when we started in 2010. The first thing we started doing was building content, and then after it got built, I was like, okay, how do you get control of this? How do you have, you know, I don't like to use the term single source of truth because it's been driven into the ground by others. But in reality, you know, you do need to make sure that you understand the assets and the virtual assets that are being deployed into your deliverable. And what I found when we started adopting BIM in 2003, 2004 at JBA, I was getting pushed further and further out of that deliverable. And that was really challenging for me because I was kind of hands-on as an engineer. But I think really getting control of your resources, understanding what your people are using, is specific to when it comes to the virtual assets or the content that they're using, making sure that you have an understanding of what you have within your ecosystem. And this is where I think the industry missed it a little bit, because the content and the virtual assets, yes, there's BPM portion of that. That's half of that ecosystem, but then you've got your internal toolbox. And if your internal toolbox is a mess, your people are going to be inefficient. So I guess that's how I would speak to that, is get control over the virtual assets, and then really get control, at least within your own ecosystem, get control of the structure of the data for those assets if you're really going to advance in this journey we're on.
I think a big thing that the cloud has to offer, and of course Unify does this, but it's a single source of truth. If you take into account like the typical office environment, there are people, I mean, even my own desktop is to kind of even account for this, but there's stuff stored quickly as a desktop point of reference, quickly in a project folder directory. But when it just starts growing legs and essentially walking off, you really run the risk of not having, like Dwayne was talking about, this real-time true data. And that's really, I think, the only thing that the cloud has to do that. I don't see another system even capable. So like we've been talking about, you know, where we've come from now. So maybe a little bit now as far as like the present, so a big topic sometimes I've found, especially when I've implemented Revit in the past, is they think Revit is BIM, but Revit's simply a tool for BIM. So aside from Revit, because I definitely recognize there are a lot of weaknesses within that platform, what other tool sets do you guys believe are essential to properly implement the BIM technology?
Guess I'll take that one. I mean, so I think there's a lot of opportunities, a lot of software, and it's only growing. Like with the advent of a lot of new AEC investment companies and a lot of startups, there's just a ton of new tools, new widgets, new technologies coming out all the time. Of course, like one of my favorite tools to help implement some of this stuff, you know, is of course Dynamo and Grasshopper. You know, like the cool thing about some of those tools, I call them the gateway drug, you know, into programming, because that you can start to get your feet wet and it's visual. So like people that are maybe a little intimidated by textual programming, like the visual programming allows you, it's a little more intuitive. And so one of the things that I love about that though is the analogy of the Matrix. And you guys remember like the Matrix when the child is asking Neo to bend the spoon and the spoon is bending? Like those tools that reference is a good analogy for bending the rules of Revit or bending the rules of some of these AEC programs. So if there isn't a tool that currently exists, you can start to leverage some of these other kind of computational tools to kind of bend the rules of reality, if you will, the reality that we know that exists and overcome some of those limitations. So that's one comment I would make, because I do feel like, man, I could think of 40 different startup companies right now that have their own niche in development, you know, test fitting and all kinds of different technologies, but some that you can start to readily adopt and actually start to build your own tools. I think that's actually even more exciting personally.
Agreed. Ben, did you have anything to maybe add to that with what you see on the manufacturer side? Especially if they're struggling?
Yeah, I would say, you know, the toolkit is going to change, you know, almost monthly in terms of what it was saying about velocity. I feel like, you know, if I was running a firm right now, I'd be signing like monthly licenses so that I can swap stuff out because it is changing so rapidly. And I think what's even more important than a list of specific softwares, but is maybe just an internal process. And I think that's just so crucial to critically think about what tools we're using. I think a lot of firms have like software review committees and things like that, and BIM managers audit their licenses, and Autodesk slams this or that on your desk. And that's all great, but who in your firm is really critically looking at how things are being done, that actually understands what needs to be done, both from a production standpoint as the low-level intern who's cranking out drawings all day, to the person who understands the business model of how a set needs to go together. I think that's probably the most important thing when considering what's out there. And the firms that I've seen most successful with that are looking at it almost quarterly in terms of what their stack looks like. Because otherwise it sort of stagnates and you get a pile of stuff that you might use here or there when in reality, you've moved on from that. So I think that's probably, rather than a specific, I know that doesn't answer the question specifically. It's not a specific software I'm saying, but I think that's just crucial to having the right stack.
I think the process.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry,
the process piece of it is really critical, because one of the things that we know as people who serve this domain, everybody has a unique tech stack. Everybody's got a unique tool set. So having that individual inside your firm who kind of at least understands your ecosystem and how it's knitted together. And I agree with you, Ben, that it really does come down to, it's not so much about a software specific, but if we have all these, and I know this because as a CEO, I look at some of our subscription lists of like, what do we do with this tool? And that list can get really long, and you end up having things that have really aren't being used a lot, that sneak their way in because over time your users are changing. But I think having that process and having intentionality around what are we using, and then also the visibility. I mean, if you can get usage data on the different things that you've got, what really is driving, driving efficiency in the organization, what tools are really being used. It's a unique set for firm to firm to firm, which is why standardization is so hard.
Exactly, and that's the whole thing with the tech stack too. And Ben, you definitely alluded to it. It's not all software, not by a long shot. There's workflows, there's protocols, there's a certain flow of how everything ultimately stitches together. So maybe we can talk a little bit about what the process has kind of been in the past for you, Dwayne, Ben, even as you work with manufacturers, and of course, Bill, from all your different avenues, is what process has really been in use the past to evaluate that BIM tech stack, whether it's software, whether it's process. I'll leave it pretty open-ended here.
Yeah, I'll kind of fire back and say, since we're on the future of BIM here, I mean, I think a lot of the past processes that are in firms are really unhealthy, and at least from what I've seen at different firms that I've either been a part of or have gotten to peek behind the curtain on. And Bill and Dwayne, feel free if you have an exemplar, but I think really that is a big part of the future of BIM, is getting real about better process and better removal of politics in the inter-office culture, whether that's from multiple locations or multiple firms who work together as consultants, or whether it's taking a good hard look at the way contract documents are written. I think that a lot of that red tape is what's keeping what's actually beneath the surface, which could be the future, from emerging. And I think that is one of the biggest opportunities that we have over the next 5 to 10 years, is to remove red tape and to help our firms to move forward on process and people and politics. I think that would unleash a second or third wave of technological innovation just through the process.
I think, I can't remember if it was Colin Powell or who would never let a good crisis go to waste. If you think about what we've been going through and you think about the way that it's kind of forced the hands of organizations to figure out how do we leverage cloud, how do we work remotely and collaborate in a meaningful way. So I think really, if we look at the different things that we've kind of had our hand forced as a domain, because, a lot of the consulting engineering space in particular, it's, if someone's not changing their desk, how do you know they're working? That's kind of the mindset. And, they've been forced out of that. And even, I won't mention any names, but I was talking to a CEO of a big publicly held company, and he was just really, in our space, he was really surprised pleasantly at how effective the organization could be working remotely. I think the second piece on that is, again, it comes back to getting that champion at the executive level. It's really important. And maybe that's just my personal experience. You know, Megan Green, who's our product manager now, used to be my design technologist at JBA 15 years ago or so. And I used to tell her, I said, look, we're making this transition and I'm your air support. So if anybody's digging their heels in or giving you a hard time, pull me in and, you know, I'll drop a few bombs and we'll get things straightened out. And I actually had an all hands one time in front of the whole company, told them, I said, by the way, by March 30th, and this was like 6 months away, we will be doing nothing but Revit. And, you know, the whole place almost like, oh, but it was, and I had to back off of that, obviously, but I was really putting a line in the sand. And I think at the executive level, if you can find that champion, I think that's probably the biggest step. The other is, I think back to what Bill said, is, you know, go to them and show them the value as opposed to trying to describe it to them. You know, iterate and figure out, okay, what tools, what resources, what does this really mean to the business at the end of the day in terms of making us more efficient and making us more healthy and profitable.
Yeah, in the context of process, I did a talk about 10 years ago, and it was called "It's the Process, Stupid." And I pulled it from Bill Clinton. It's the economy, stupid. That was kind of his slogan in the early days. But it was kind of my observation of saying, okay, we're using Revit as this glorified drafting tool. Like, exactly. I don't understand what we're doing here. And there was all these series, you know, as you go through a project life cycle, whether it's programming through schematic design, all the way through CA and procurement, you have what I call this data drop chasm. You have model drop chasms and data drop chasms all throughout the life cycle of the project. And it's this massive, massive, massive waste of data. And so they just announced a few years ago, I think it was in it was The Economist. They announced that data is more valuable than oil. Like data just surpassed the value of oil. Now, like, think about that. Like, how much money, you know, Exxon and all these other companies make off of oil. And if we have all of this data in our industry and we're just throwing it away. So like, or on a more optimistic side of it, you're sitting on a gold mine. You have all of this data. So what can you start doing with that data? How do you leverage the data, et cetera? And so like the whole process really needs to shift and change in the way that we streamline data, the way that we leverage it, so that way we're more efficient, you know, moving forward. Exactly.
And kind of maybe speaking to that data, you were just kind of piggybacking off of that a little bit. How important is data management, and what's the risk at the moment, I guess you could say, for those who are failing to leverage that data right now?
I mean, I would reiterate what I said. I mean, it's one, you're losing money on your projects at the very least, on the negative side. On the positive side, people that see a problem as an opportunity, like I said before, you can start to monetize data. I know people that are starting to grab, you know, real estate data and web scraping, and there's so much data that you have within your firm that you could, like, if you start having project programmatic data, like you could start leveraging that data for other firms, you know, to understand histories of projects and costing of projects and costing of materials and costing of different project typologies, whether healthcare, science and technology, libraries, K-12. Like, there's so much data in there, and so many opportunities for firms to start leveraging that data. Either one, just to make their life happier and better, like, so that way they're not having to sit in front of a computer and punch in, you know, the same data from one monitor onto another. Like, if you could streamline that. But then from like a business opportunity, you could really start to leverage the data to do something really powerful for yourself and or for your company.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think there's a huge opportunity with data. And I think that's one of the reasons when we talk to customers, because there's a lot of different standards out there. And, you know, and what I've learned in the industry, and Ben, you can weigh in on this, but try and get your firm to standardize around one standard door detail or one standard lighting control detail across multiple offices, even within an office and across departments, is really, really difficult. But I think the data standardization is key to what you're talking about as well, Bill, because if you can get standardized within your ecosystem, now you can mine it and get coherence from it. it's really difficult to take noise and turn it into valuable, intelligible and coherent information that's actually resulting in actionable analytics. So I think, if nothing else, at ground zero within your own firm, make sure you've got structure to your own data, because then you're going to be able to leverage it and utilize it to drive business efficiency and to drive, analytics are going to create competitive advantage in the long run. And as you scale that out, because it's funny you reference a sawtooth, I always talk about that, the transition in phase of the building life cycle between design to build to operator, and then the BPM layering in over all of that. There's so much information that's either totally recreated, thrown out and made into a rudimentary, so that what we end up with is kind of glorified visualization. And I think those who figure out that what this model really is a 3D visual database, and what the BIM workflows are really about is that information and that data piece. Those are the firms that are going to take us into the future. And the manufacturer layers into that, all the different personas that are involved, and all the different stakeholders, and if we can engage them and stop recreating stuff, stop having that big sawtooth drop off every time we hand information between different stakeholders, I think that's going to really move the industry forward.
Ben, real quick question on that before, and I'm trying not to dive too far down the rabbit hole, I think, of data and subsequent AI right now. But I'm curious, before we do that, and I want to address something that's been coming up in the chat quite a bit right now, is what are manufacturers looking at right now for data? Elijah kind of mentioned in the chat just a little bit ago too, but the digital transformation is really accelerating, A and E, that's absolutely 100% given. But what about manufacturers, contractors, real estate? Why have they been more reluctant to adapt these data-based workflows and business models?
I think a big part of it is that for a lot of manufacturers, they are so old that they've never really had to. A lot of them are sitting really pretty right now in terms of, hey, we've been in business 100 years, we've been successful, why should we change now? That sort of mentality. And then you kind of get this other group of folks who want to change, but they have this problem where all of their, call it data, I guess, to use an overused word, I guess, but all of their data is really tribal knowledge that exists. And, oh, well, if you want to know the span for a whatchamacallit, you need to talk to Harry. He's the expert on that, and we'll get him out to your site to blah, blah, blah. And that's wonderful that Harry can do that and can run those calculations in his head. But the problem is, if Harry gets hit by the bus, not to be morbid, but when Harry gets hit by the bus, all that tribal knowledge is lost. And so that's a big part of what we've endeavored to do with BIMsmith, is capture a lot of that and help brands to take what would otherwise just be tribal knowledge and put it into a structured format, so that then you all can tap into that however you see fit. And so that's really, that's a long way to go in terms of where we have that. But there are some manufacturers who have made total transformations from that tribal knowledge and notebooks and things like that to actual databases that we've been able to tap into. So there is a light at the end of the tunnel that a lot of manufacturers are investing in BIM technology and really standardizing that and leveraging that across all of their different tool sets that they have today. But it is a challenge, and we'll keep pushing them to make that available, because at the end of the day, nobody knows more about windows than a window company, and nobody knows more about boilers than a boiler company. And that's something that I think a lot of us as professionals forget, is that there is literally an encyclopedia on every product that you're going to specify contained within the resources of a manufacturer. Might not be on their website, might not be a data feed, but one way or another, we're going to get it. And it's important to remember that that's out there as a resource.
I think the other thing on the BPM side too that's a challenge is the persona is so different. When you look at the architects, the engineers, contractors, owner-operators that we work with that kind of cover that design, build, and operate side of it, you know, the motivations for your building product manufacturer is really about how do I get more people specifying my product during the design phase of it, procuring it during, you know, constructing. And it's a bit of a different motivation. So that persona is kind of an edge case when you think about their persona in the context of all the stakeholders that really have to come together to get that building delivered. So I think that's probably one of the other areas, is that you really got to look at how are they going to be able to drive sales and marketing, which I know you guys do a great job with, Ben, with the BIM Smith platform. You know, they want visibility, they want eyeballs, and they want to know that, okay, if I do this, I'm going to be able to drive more sales of my product, and I'm going to get maybe product feedback on the back end where I can improve my product process. So there's that dynamic that comes into play too, which I think kind of complicates it.
Yeah, and to that point, we're seeing more manufacturers step up and say, I want to be a stakeholder.
Yeah.
Which is also something that's really encouraging as a trend towards the future. Instead of viewing myself as a manufacturer as how can I blitz as much marketing stuff into the air as I can, and how can I make sure I'm getting the leads? We want the leads. We want your names. Oh my God, we're gonna die.
Throw the product over the wall.
Yeah, and you know, moving past that to being a stakeholder and saying, how can we come up to the table with the engineer, with the architect, with the owner, and add value to the process. Yeah. That's the future of how manufacturers will need to interact if they want to have a place at the table. They have to add value to it. And so the ice is melting on that as well. So that's exciting to see the upper echelons of manufacturers viewing themselves as consultative and as stakeholders rather than just, you know, selling stuff.
Agreed with that. And kind of speaking along that data transformation, and like Ben, you had mentioned it earlier, and I really kind of like how you said it. It terrifies me. But the idea of how you wanted to almost pursue this monthly licensing, because there is so many gaps in the workflow, so many new products that are filling those gaps. And a big thing that came out just, I think it was maybe 2 days ago, was an open letter against Autodesk. So has everybody here been able to read that open letter? Zaha Hadid, I think Gensler was also on there. Some $22 million, I think, if memory serves, reading that article, worth of investment on Autodesk licensing, and they're hollering. So what are your thoughts regarding that open letter? Did anybody read it?
I haven't seen it yet.
I saw the post. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. But the context, as I understand it, though, was basically the architecture and engineering community is appalled and upset that they continue to have to pay subscription licensing or paying for software that they feel has not added any intrinsic value over the years. Is that correct? I believe that's
absolutely correct.
Okay,
yep.
That's my understanding of it.
I know some of the bundling and some of the other, even as a firm or form owner, when that Autodesk bill would, you know, come to me to review before the CFO signed off on it, it definitely gave me pause. So I haven't read the letter yet, though, so I can't really comment.
One of the key frustrations that I saw outlined there is the change of the business model. I think they quoted something like 3 or 4 subscription model changes over the last 5 years. And
that's right.
That, and also a perceived lack of investment in the core tool, being Revit. One of the other things they said is that they stopped selling us packages of suites of products that we're only really going to use 2 of. You know, those are some of the things. You know, having read it, I think it's great that the community, even competitors, you know, were willing to sign on to something. I think it's great to say, hey, we're still here as AD&E, architecture, design, and engineering. I think Autodesk has been, rightfully so, making some investments, heavy investments on the construction side of things. I mean, we just heard about the latest acquisition, I think it was about a week ago. They bought another construction software. But at the end of the day, architecture and design are what made Autodesk the behemoth that they are, that allows them to benefit, to be able to invest in newer spaces like construction. I think it's just really important that the management team there keeps that in mind. I think they do. I think they take that very seriously, but I think there has to be a balance as well to continue to invest in A&D to push that forward. I think that's just, to me, if I were Andrew Anganos, that's what I would be looking at, and finding a way to, I guess, show some love to A&D and E. And there certainly have, to the Revit's team credit, there have been some great releases in the last couple of years. But I think what this letter says is it's not fast enough. The rate of change is not fast enough, given all the other headaches. And I'll give a shout out to Aaron Maller, who's my go-to person to hear, the latest on Autodesk licensing. But he'll give you a rant about how the latest licensing editor isn't working, or this, that, or other thing. I think he tweets at Andrew directly, and they solve it right there on Twitter. But I think that if you had a seamless license experience that had predictable cost models, the other side of the rate of innovation and investment in the product might not be as much of an issue. Or if you had a very high expeditious rate of change in the product and it's evolving on a very regular basis at a very fast pace, maybe then the licensing and cost changes wouldn't feel as bad. I think it's just the two come together that cause the rub. And I think it's great anytime an industry as a whole can agree on anything. So whether Autodesk chooses to do anything or not, I think it's a great step for the industry to be able to agree on something and to be able to communicate it. So those would be my thoughts.
I think one of the challenges too to kind of keep in mind, because I think it was in 2016 or 2017 that they really made the move from migrating Revit from more enterprise-based to truly being a cloud. And I think there's been a lot of, between C4R and some of the other things that have come out, I think they're also trying to figure it out. So, there's that side of it too. But yeah, as a former firm owner, the bundling thing and, having to buy a package as opposed to really being able to pay for what I need, that can also be, it's challenging when, and Revit's not just, I noticed in the note, it's like, oh, North America, Revit's the 800-pound gorilla globally. I mean, we do work in Australia. I was in Hong Kong for 3 years with my former firm. And if you're doing building information modeling, the predominant name that you hear everywhere on the globe is really Autodesk and Revit. And I believe that's because they had such a huge installed base of CAD, and everybody just migrated over to, well, this makes sense. It's Autodesk, and let's migrate to their building information modeling platform. So there's that plays into it too, but they definitely are the dominant force. And it does, give you a little bit of pause when you think about if everything end to end is within that ecosystem. You can see why that would concern, I know with the firms that you mentioned that are on the letter.
Exactly. And one of our attendees had kind of mentioned a certain quote that Revit's all about the data, but Revit really, in my opinion, does a poor job making it readily available. That's why we have all these additional tool sets to fill those types of gaps. So what the letter also called for was, quote, a replacement of Revit from the ground up. And it petrifies even somebody like myself, because I watched the CAD to Revit transition. So what's next? What does the future kind of hold for us? So maybe that's an idea. Maybe that's the question I'll pose to you guys. Like, what's the future of BIM now? Maybe in terms of AI, computational design, Revit. What's everyone's thoughts with that?
I would talk to it a little bit just from a former CEO and owner of a consulting engineering practice with 15 offices and a big staff. When you've got that investment into a platform and you've got your workflows tied to it, and the change, I mean, the resistance, some of that resistance to change is just a business reality. Because if you try to retool that whole group at a very fast pace, meanwhile, I've got projects going out the door on a weekly basis. I liken it to, someone's going down the freeway. If it's me, it's probably 70, 75. And you're trying to change the tires on the car or work on the engine while it's, still got to maintain its rate of speed. So that's the challenge that at a user level, that's the challenge that the users are going to face. Yeah, we could say, well, we're going to build this new platform and we're going to put it out there. The adoption in the domain, it's not that we're tech averse, it's just that the technology's really got to lend itself to helping us be better at our job without a lot of overhead in terms of spending, countless hours to learn this new technology. Technology should just really work for the user. So that's, I guess, my roundabout way of not answering the question.
It's all good.
So my opinion is, we've been talking a lot about data and Revit and BIM and all of that. I think that's good. And for the future of it, where things are going, I think, is we're going to start doing stuff with the data, right? So instead of just pulling a hardware schedule or door schedule or lighting fixture schedule, now we're going to start thinking about how do we optimize the placement of said light fixtures? How do we optimize the placement of diffusers? And so like, if you start thinking about data-driven design, computational design, leveraging data to be able to optimize a project, so that way it does have the maximum amount of daylighting, so that it does have the shortest departmental adjacencies for departments that are closest to each other. I think the one piece that is completely untapped that no one is really starting to talk about is like the idea of engineering. Like, we see so much marketing for generative design for architecture. Do you know how incredibly easy it is to computationally design something that's purely math? Structural, mechanical, lighting, like you got foot candles, you have structural load capacity. I mean, all of that information is purely math driven, where architecture tends to be quite more subjective. And so I think the future of where we're going to be going is we're going to start to see quite a few more companies starting up, but they're going to be very niche. You're going to start seeing like the testfit.io of MEP. You're going to start seeing computational construction and some of these principles applied to some of these other things where everything is just formulaic and math based, and it's just going to further perpetuate and propel the industry to move forward. And ironically, I actually feel we're in the exact same place we were at in 2008. We're in the middle of a recession. We're in the middle of emerging technologies just starting to get traction and get off the ground. So like the next 10 years here, this next decade, I feel like is going to be like it has been in the sense of new technologies emerging coming out of a recession. However, I think with the advent of AI and ML, all of that information is going to ridiculously perpetuate, like snowball the technology, that it's going to grow substantially more than it did in the last 10 years. And further, for people's comments about like our industry being slow to adopt change, by the way, the market doesn't care. Like if it helps someone do their job faster, they're going to hire that guy to do it, or they're going to buy that software to do it. No one's complaining that Uber is putting taxi companies out of business and that Airbnb, the hotel companies, are all upset. The market does not care, does not care. It will go the way of whatever is pragmatic and makes the most sense. And so that's what we'll see over the next few years, in my opinion.
And I think that ties back to what we talked about earlier. It's those companies that have that culture of agility, the culture of innovation, are going to lean into, because this is really what's happened is there's been imposed innovation for these companies because no one planned on a pandemic or, what's going on. So it's been imposed on them that, look, you got to think on your feet. You got to be agile if you're going to stay relevant and you're going to stay as a business as we work our way through this. So I think you're spot on. And I think the adoption of technology, that refresh rate that firms has been getting, as we become more of a technology-driven industry and technology-driven domain, a refresh rate has been getting quicker and quicker. Not quicker, but it's better than it used to be, I guess is the way I would put it.
For sure.
So there's one last question I think we can maybe squeeze in real quick, and that's really talking about facilities maintenance. And Ben, working with manufacturers with this content, these components, are you seeing that come up in your discussions at all?
Yeah, it is. I mean, from just a data standpoint, we're putting things like operating manuals and warranties and all of that is pretty standard stuff at this point. Layering that data in for the FMs. One conversation that does come up more often than not when that topic comes up with manufacturers is, do we need to get more detailed with the content that we're providing as almost a separate version of the Revit family specifically targeted to FMs for as-built and things like that. So, that's still an evolving conversation, but it's certainly on everyone's radar that the FMs are starting to use BIM more often, and in some cases it's just getting handed off from the design team, even though that's a little bit more rare. But just making sure that the information's there for 10 years from now is a very real scenario.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think all of this data change is really going to be a big part of that. So does anyone have anything left to add? We are right at the top of the hour. I tried to address Q&A as we could. I do have apologies to landscape questions that were asked and all sorts of really niche industries. We tried to keep it a little high level just for the sake of time. But Dwayne, Bill, Ben, any final thoughts here?
So just for the landscape guy, you're working outside, you're in pretty good shape. I think you're going to continue to evolve and be healthy. The paving companies in Vegas are making a fortune right now. Anybody who's working outside, they seem to be accelerating all their contracts.
All right, guys. Well, we will send out this recording. It's a pleasure having all of you here. And until next time, stay safe out there.
Thanks for moderating, Karen.
Yeah,
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Take care,
Be
guys.
safe.
Bye-bye.
Cheers. Bye now.